He was no lunatic. He knew exactly what he was doing.
One of the first things he said was, "I will cut off the hand of the foreigner."
At the time, I saw Khomeini as the Mahatma Gandhi of Iran.
In his lighter moments, Khomeini wrote poetry of love. There was this other side of Khomeini.
He was quite germ-phobic, almost to a pathological extent.
As a leader, he also acquiesced in, if not directly supported, the execution of large numbers of Iranians.
I don't think he was a fanatic. I think he simply lived in a world that we never understood.
He is arguably one of the most despised figures of our time. And like all charismatic leaders, he is also one of the most revered. But above all, the Ayatollah Khomeini is a paradox. A holy man who used 1,300 years of tradition to pull off the most modern of revolutions. The Ayatollah Khomeini emerged on the international stage in 1978 and eventually came to symbolize one of America's most embarrassing diplomatic disasters.
Iranian students holding some 60 American embassy employees hostage at the embassy compound in Tehran today warned that they would kill their captives if the United States tried to intervene with force.
Under the Ayatollah, thousands of Iranians were executed. Personal freedoms vanished. In the case of author Salman Rushdie, the wrong words brought a death sentence.
There's this view we have of him. It's this easy view that Khomeini tried to drag Iran into the 7th century. We are dealing with a highly political man. That he wore a turban was accidental.
Khomeini was a towering presence who took on the Shah of Iran, President Carter, and Saddam Hussein. Yet he has remained an enigma who revealed nothing of himself. And over time, fables and legends grew up to replace hard facts. The result is a story filled with lingering doubts about his date of birth, about how he was raised. Even the most traumatic event of his early life, the murder of his father, remains unsolved. Most details of the first 60 years of Khomeini's life are shrouded in mystery. The facts, like the veiled women of his revolution, are kept hidden from the prying eyes of the outside world. It is perhaps a fitting legacy for the mystical cleric and philosopher who became a ruthless dictator. At the dawn of the 20th century, Ruhollah al-Musawi was born into a family steeped in ancient traditions. They lived on the fringe of the Iranian desert, in a mud brick house in the dusty hamlet of Khomeini. Apart from his place of birth, few facts are known. Many of his followers claim that Khomeini was born into a poor peasant family, but surviving family members tell a very different story.
Contrary to this popular image that the family was terribly poor, he did grow up, according to his brother and other family members, in a lovely house with a lush garden and servants.
They were people who were well off. They were landed people. So, he did not come from the underclass of his society. But very few leaders who organize the underclass come from the underclass.
In turn-of-the-century Iran, a religious pedigree could be as important as money. And it was for this reason that Khomeini's family was best known. The family traced its lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad, and both Khomeini's grandfather and father were religious scholars known as mullahs. One crucial fact is not disputed. When Khomeini was just 6 months old, his father, Saeed Mustafa, was murdered. According to popular myth, Khomeini's father was killed by the Shah of Iran. But like so much of his story, this is simply not true. The Shah would not come to power for another 25 years. Most historians now agree that Saeed Mustafa was probably the victim of a local dispute. The young Khomeini seemed destined for a solitary life. When he was just 6 years old, both his mother and aunt died of cholera. Suddenly, Khomeini was an orphan. The youngest of 6 children, he was raised by relatives in a devout Islamic environment. He was a precocious child, who is said to have read the Quran by the time he was 7. Perhaps because he had no parents of his own, Khomeini gravitated towards his religious teachers. As a teenager, he followed a leading theologian to the holy city of Qom. Here he would prepare to become a teacher himself.
A student like that would be assigned a small room in one of the courtyards of this great complex of schools and seminaries. And this is a training that is still very medieval in its structure, in that it is basically a study of texts. I think, the formation was crucial with Khomeini.
But Khomeini was expected to do more than study. At the age of 27, he approached an affluent Ayatollah and asked for his daughter's hand in marriage. The 15-year-old girl, Khadija, served tea to her suitor, but in keeping with strict Islamic custom, she was almost entirely hidden from his view by a veil or chador. She, however, could see him.
And she liked what she'd seen. And so that night she had a dream, and she dreamt that all the prophets were gathered together, and all of them were talking about what a great religious leader that young Ruhollah from Khomeini was going to turn out to be. And she told her parents, and that they thought the dream was divinely inspired, and so they allowed the match to go ahead.
Khadija, it seems, chose well. By most accounts, Khomeini was an ideal husband.
According to his family, Ayatollah Khomeini was really quite the New Age man. He would get up in the night when his children were babies and take a turn to give them their bottles. He never asked his wife to do anything for him, not even so much as to bring him a glass of water or to match his socks.
But if Khomeini's married life was harmonious, the political climate was not. In 1925, an uneducated soldier named Reza Shah seized power. The new leader was committed to creating a Western secular state, in part by undermining the religious elite.
And Reza Shah was determined to destroy the clergy. At one point, we know he stormed into one of the seminaries in Qom and personally whipped one of the mullahs. And Khomeini, as a man, felt this, the force of this grievance, and felt the heavy hand of Reza Shah.
Khomeini took the Shah's actions very personally, for religion was both his tradition and his profession. The Shah was in effect attacking all that Khomeini stood for. And when the Shah ruled that women were forbidden to wear the chador in public, he made an enemy of Khomeini's wife, Khadija, as well.
She didn't leave her house for more than a year when the prohibition on the chador was being most stringently enforced. And Khadija stayed at home even though their home had no bathroom, which was fairly typical of simple homes in Iran at that time. And she needed to go to the public bathhouse. Well, she had to go without that.
In the 1930s, Khomeini, like his mentor, began teaching at the seminary in Qom. He was known for bringing politics into the classroom and urged his students to be moral in the face of oppression.
He always said the most important holy war that a Muslim can carry out is not the external war, but the internal war, the mastery of self. And I think young seminarians found all that very exciting.
Khomeini may have been popular with his students, but he could be strict with his family. During the 1930s, Khomeini had 8 children. His daughter Zara has said that Khomeini imposed the same austerity on his sons that he demanded of himself.
He had 2 sons, and Zahra says that she remembers one of the few fights between her mother and father was over the mother's having bought a ball for Ahmed to play with, and he didn't believe that his son should be spending time frivolously by playing ball.
But in these volatile times, even Khomeini became preoccupied with less spiritual matters. When, during World War II, the Allies ousted the Shah of Iran and installed his son Mohammad Reza Shah on the throne, Khomeini wrote a book in protest.
We have in this book the early hint as to the kind of government Khomeini regards as ideal. In this book, he doesn't oppose the institution of monarchy, but he does say that the monarch should be chosen by the clerical community, and he should be a king who will rule according to Islamic law.
Khomeini's anti-Western views were shared by many Iranians. In 1953, a nationalist movement became so popular that the Shah fled Iran. Within a matter of days, however, an American-sponsored coup returned him to power. For Khomeini, this was yet another demonstration of Western arrogance. But he refrained from making a public protest out of respect for his religious superior and mentor.
He had a period of relative quiescence because the main religious leaders who were senior to him were not political people. They wanted to stay out of the line of fire, and he heeded their advice and he heeded their counsel.
But in 1961, his mentor died, and suddenly Khomeini felt free to speak out. After a lifetime of obscurity, the cleric from Qom was ready to launch a revolution. A legendary leader was about to be born. By 1963, Khomeini was a senior cleric in the religious center of Qom. He had risen to the level of Ayatollah, meaning literally reflection of God. Revered for his uncompromising dedication to Islam, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had fathered 3 sons and 5 daughters, had grown more lenient in private. According to one daughter, he was a doting grandfather.
She talks about him very warmly. She talks about his relations with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, how much, even though he presented himself so austerely, there was room for fun with the kids, that when they played hide and seek, he would let them hide under his long clerical robes.
But these moments of levity were rare. The Ayatollah was deadly serious when it came to the fate of his country. In 1963, he was particularly angered when the Shah launched a reform movement known as the White Revolution, designed to modernize Iran.
It was an attempt on the part of the Shah to speak the language of reform, and this gave Khomeini all the ammunition he needed.
Khomeini seized his moment and delivered an emotionally charged sermon during the Islamic month of mourning. Khomeini likened the Shah to the notorious assassin of a 7th century martyr.
He was completely fearless, and I think that a lot of people were drawn to him because of this quality he had.
I think the speech not only was an extraordinarily harsh political attack on the king, but it also was a very major assertion of clerical authority against that of the state.
The next day, the Shah had Khomeini thrown in prison. Several days of rioting followed, as years of pent-up rage spilled onto the streets. The outspoken Ayatollah from Qom instantly became a national hero.
The extent of the rioting that took place would suggest that already by 1963 he had a large following, not only in the city of Qom, where he had been a very popular teacher among seminarians and the public at large, but also in other cities as well. And it also tells us something about Khomeini's extraordinary ability to seize the moment, to know what themes, what rhetoric resounded powerfully with his listeners.
After 10 months in prison, Khomeini was released, but not subdued. In October 1964, he launched a new crusade against a law that extended immunity to American military personnel. For Khomeini, it was proof that Western influence was more entrenched than ever in Iran.
Khomeini went to the crowd and told them, look, there is now a system of capitulations in Iran, that the Americans now can rule your country, that an American dog, I think it was his language, now had more rights than an Iranian.
Khomeini's protest reverberated in the schools, in the bazaars, in the mosques. Within days, the Ayatollah was exiled, first to Turkey, and later to the major Shiite center of Najaf, Iraq. Here he lived in a modest 2-story house with Khadija, where his daily routine remained unchanged.
He kept very bizarre hours because he would wake up in the middle of the night to pray from about 3 in the morning till about 6 in the morning. So it was a routine and one that was, by our standards, a bit strange.
As in the monastic days of his youth, Khomeini led a simple, serious, and highly ordered life.
He was also almost obsessively clean in his own personal habits. He would wear a sort of a bib to take his meals so he wouldn't get any specks of food on his clothing. When he was taking medications, he would use a separate spoon for each medicine bottle to get out the pills that he needed to take. He was quite germ-phobic, it sounds like, almost to a pathological extent.
But throughout his exile, the Ayatollah never lost sight of his one simple message, that the Shah had to go. In many instances, it was his students in Najaf who relayed these pronouncements back to students in Iran. At other times, Khomeini's own family was enlisted.
His daughter would go and visit him in his exile in Iraq and bring back his speeches. She would hide them in her clothes, and then they would secretly reproduce them. And then they'd go around by night, and she would have her young son climb up the high walls and throw these incendiary pamphlets over the walls of the houses, and that was one way that he got his message out.
Yet although Khomeini was a recognized religious leader, he was not regarded as a politician. For most anti-monarchists, the Ayatollah was a valuable rabble-rouser, not a future statesman.
I didn't consider him a political analyst or someone who was interested in political theory. It was really my mistake. I should have. His book, Islamic Government, definitely was a significant political pamphlet that should have been read by people like me, but we didn't pay attention to it.
But then, as if on cue, the Shah began providing the Ayatollah with almost unlimited opportunities to galvanize support. In 1973, the Shah persuaded the Organization of Oil-Producing Countries, OPEC, to raise the price of oil. Money began pouring into the country. Yet with the influx of riches came greater repression.
There is a passage in Shakespeare which says, so foul a sky clears not without a storm. The Shah had created a foul sky in Iran.
For Khomeini, the attacks began to hit very close to home. In January of 1978, a scathing criticism of Khomeini appeared in a government-controlled newspaper. Many of his followers believed the article had been planted by the Shah, and Iran exploded in a series of demonstrations. By the end of the year, hundreds of protesters had been killed. Khomeini publicly blamed the Shah for the deaths. The Shah, fearing an all-out revolution, is believed to have put pressure on Iraq to expel the Ayatollah. Iraq complied, and Khomeini fled to France, where he settled into the Paris suburb of Neuf-le-Château.
Apparently, when he was driving from the airport to the house, he didn't look out the car window once because he didn't want to be corrupted by any visions of the hated West.
Once he settled in, there were other adjustments to be made. The cleric who had become so used to the monastic life found himself in a very modern world.
The suburban house that had been obtained for him had a Western-style pedestal toilet. Well, he thought that this was an example of Western decadence, and he wanted to stick to the traditional ways of Persian culture, which is a squat facility, so he had the pedestal toilet removed and a squat toilet installed.
But even in the suburbs of Paris, Khomeini observed his time-honored routines.
Twice a day he would come out of his house and walk over to an apple tree, sit down with a little pillow propped behind his back, dressed in a sort of brown cloak and his turban and these funny blue plastic sandals, and preach to about 30 or 40 students who came from around Europe to pay homage. It was a very quiet, serene atmosphere in those days, and I looked at it just as an interesting sort of feature story on a funny old religious man who thought he could bring Islamic revolution to Iran. Allahu Akbar.
There were people who came back spreading the good news that this was a humble man, a simple man, who just simply wants the good of his nation. And when the time comes, he will bow out and he will leave politics to those who know politics.
But as the world's press descended on the tiny enclave in search of the simple Ayatollah, Khomeini, the politician, was secretly planning to overthrow the Shah of Iran and create a religious dictatorship which would eventually hold America hostage.
The Vikings. They had no empire, no capital city, and no king. At their strongest, they were only 300,000.
By 1978, the Ayatollah Khomeini had been catapulted to international fame. He was an unlikely celebrity, a grandfather in his late 70s, whose world was centered on the 7th century Quran. Yet he was leading a very modern revolution that was about to change the world.
It was a masterful media operation, which was very strange. It was the first cassette revolution. He had a whole staff of young students who turned the garage of one of the houses into a sort of cassette reproduction center. So he would give a sermon, they would tape it, and they would mass produce it and ship it back to Iran. It really was a media revolution, and we were complicit.
But while attention was focused on Khomeini, his archenemy the Shah was rapidly losing ground. The Iranians' rage had reached boiling point. The country exploded in a new wave of riots and strikes. Finally, on January the 16th, 1979, the Shah gave up his fight.
And it's the most exhilarating, the most joyous day of my life. I had never seen Tehran to be in such a mood of celebration.
For Khomeini, it was an unprecedented victory. After 14 years in exile, the Ayatollah came home. Millions of Iranians, rich and poor, religious and secular, flooded the streets in support. Yet even in his moment of triumph, the Ayatollah appeared quite unmoved.
One journalist asked him, "What are you feeling?" And he looked up and he said, "Nothing." In the true tradition of Shiite Islam, he covered over his true feelings and just acted as if this was business as usual.
It was, of course, not business as usual. Khomeini's return was cast in a messianic light. He was seen as a spiritual guide, one who presumably would not be involved in the earthly matters of government.
At the time, I saw Khomeini as the Mahatma Gandhi of Iran, someone who wants to introduce an element of nativity, tradition into the political order, someone who is not interested in power, someone who does not see himself as the next head of state.
But slowly, the true nature of Khomeini's revolution began to emerge. No longer a symbolic leader, Khomeini was in fact running the government through a radical revolutionary council of Ayatollahs, with networks that reached into the nation's seminaries and mosques. The Revolutionary Council directed local mullahs to become foot soldiers in an undeclared cultural war. Suddenly there were reports that residents were being arrested for drinking, for listening to music in their own homes. On the streets, women were forced to wear veils. Revolutionary tribunals were established, and within months, as many as 600 supposed traitors were executed. But amid the chaos, there was one terrorist act of which Khomeini did not approve. In February, a leftist group seized the US embassy. An angered Khomeini quickly intervened.
He asks his own representative to go to the embassy and ask the students to immediately vacate the compound. It means that at the first, Khomeini considered hostage-taking as an illegitimate and unacceptable political tool.
The crisis passed, but 8 months later, everything changed. When the Shah, now terminally ill with cancer, was allowed into the United States for treatment, the revolution became overtly anti-American. In November of 1979, the US Embassy in Tehran was seized for the second time that year. Iranian students took the American staff members hostage, demanding the return of the Shah to face trial.
There was sort of this carnival atmosphere. There were people hawking peanuts and beetroot and souvenirs, and whenever the TV cameras would turn on, the crowds would go crazy and scream "Death to America." And then the TV cameras would turn off and everybody would sort of go about their business again. This was extraordinary theater.
When Khomeini saw the popular response, he gave the students' action his blessing. At a time when the Ayatollah was trying to win national support for an Islamic constitution, he saw the anti-American fervor as a passport to his vision of a theocracy. The simple spiritual guide was evolving into a cynical and calculating politician.
The hostage crisis was the weapon with which Khomeini bludgeoned the liberals in his own entourage. He destroyed them. And it was the weapon with which he radicalized the Iranian revolution. And let's face it, let's give the devil his due. It worked.
In December 1979, it came as little surprise that Iranians voted to establish the first 20th century theocracy. For Khomeini, it was the ultimate triumph, his reward for standing up to Western arrogance. But the success of the revolution came at a price. Just as Khomeini had demonized America and President Carter, Americans had come to see Khomeini as the outlaw leader of a terrorist state.
I'd like to thank all the American people who have stood by us during this trying ordeal.
As the hostage deadlock dragged on, Khomeini found himself in an international crisis far beyond his experience.
Let's just hope it's over soon. That's all.
But the Ayatollah's position was secured as tragedy struck the American government in April 1980. 6 months after the hostage crisis began, President Carter authorized a covert and ultimately disastrous rescue mission. The attempt was abandoned after 2 helicopters crashed in the desert and 8 American rescuers were killed. Khomeini declared it was God's way of protecting the Islamic Revolution. The failure of the American mission certainly seemed like a gift from God, for now the Ayatollah's control of Iran became complete. But in a matter of months, Khomeini would face a new enemy, a nation as determined and fanatical as his own. By 1980, the Ayatollah Khomeini had achieved the impossible. He had ousted his enemy, the Shah, humbled the United States, and created the 20th century's first theocracy. In July, fate delivered him one more grim reward. The Shah of Iran died in exile. And yet Khomeini's greatest challenge was still to come. In September, Iran was invaded by neighboring Iraq. Technically, it was a bid to regain land lost in a 1975 agreement. But like the Ayatollah's battle with the Shah, it was also a personal vendetta.
It was a war between 2 leaders. Saddam Hussein had a personal vendetta against Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini had called him an infidel. He had challenged his legitimacy. So it was not just a war for land and a war for influence, but it was a war of enmity.
It came at a time when Iran was very vulnerable to attack. Since the hostage crisis had begun almost a year before, Iran had become economically isolated, and with many of the Shah's military experts now purged or in exile, the odds were clearly in Iraq's favor. But once again, the Ayatollah turned adversity to his political advantage.
Ironically, it helped strengthen the revolutionary government. Once Iran was at war with an external enemy, it became possible to mobilize the country again and to unify it behind this very major endeavor. It also became easier to silence internal dissent with the excuse that the country was fighting an external war.
Drawing once again on the passionate rhetoric he had used against the Shah, Khomeini mobilized a fanatical army of young would-be martyrs.
Some of the so-called warriors had very, very old weapons. Some of them only carried sticks. They sometimes wore headbands that said "Warriors of God."
Although his war was fought in the name of God, Khomeini's unbending principles could be surprisingly flexible. According to the former UN ambassador to Iran, when Khomeini learned that vital military equipment on offer from European arms dealers had originated in Israel, he still approved the purchase.
Khomeini replied, "We are not religiously obligated to ask him where they get the merchandise. Go and purchase the spare parts." Which was the beginning of a sustained trading in military weapons and spare parts with Israel during the entire war period. And the Israelis were selling arms to Iran because they didn't want Iran to be militarily defeated by a regime they considered to be far more dangerous.
The time had come to reevaluate the hostage crisis as well. President Carter had frozen billions of dollars worth of Iranian assets. Now that money was desperately needed for weapons. There were also other issues to consider. The Ayatollah felt that although he had easily defeated Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan could prove to be a tougher opponent. Negotiations began in the autumn, and in January of 1981, after 444 days in captivity, the American hostages were released.
The planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
But with the hostage crisis no longer the rallying cry, Khomeini continued to fight internal battles. In August, the Iranian president and prime minister were both assassinated. Amnesty International reported that over 1,600 executions had occurred since Khomeini's reign began. The Ayatollah's stranglehold was not only political. Culturally, the Islamic regime had grown increasingly rigid and intolerant. Personal freedoms for women in particular were removed. Soon women were being jailed for showing their hair in public. They required their husband's permission to leave the country. And women convicted of adultery suffered the traditional sentence under ancient Islamic law of being stoned to death. Yet Khomeini's fundamentalism proved surprisingly liberating for the women of Iran. Once they were covered, segregated, and regimented, the Ayatollah gave them an active role in the revolution.
Suddenly here was a cleric who was telling them that they had not only a right but a responsibility to be out in public life. And when it comes to women, we think of him as a hardliner on women's issues, but in fact in the Iranian spectrum he was a moderate.
When it came to Saddam Hussein, however, the Ayatollah was anything but moderate. In 1982, Khomeini declined a ceasefire with Iraq. Despite the odds and the terrible toll the war had already taken, Khomeini was determined to win at any cost.
At that time, Khomeini, which was the peak of his megalomania, he thought that he could do the same thing to Saddam as he did to the Shah and President Carter in his mind. So he wanted to export the revolution. He saw the defeat of Saddam Hussein as an important step.
Khomeini did not accept a ceasefire until 1988, but by then Iran had been ravaged by 8 years of war and almost 10 years of internal chaos. Yet despite his failure to overthrow Saddam Hussein, Khomeini managed to rally his devoted followers and shock the world one last time. By 1989, Khomeini had proved to be both a fearless revolutionary and a tough, resilient politician. But physically he was weak. He was now in his late 80s and suffering from a heart condition. But as a leader, he remained a skillful manipulator of popular symbols and sentiments. In February, Khomeini was informed that a Muslim author named Salman Rushdie had written a book, The Satanic Verses, that was said to have blasphemed the Prophet. It is not known if Khomeini actually read the book, but in typical fashion he clearly read the volatile mood of his revolutionary followers.
It wasn't his cause. He found it. It was brought to his attention. He sensed it. He knew what he could do with it, and he used it.
Khomeini issued an edict, or fatwa, calling for Rushdie's execution.
The fatwa of Imam Khomeini bent the world out of shape. Ancient bloodlusts were unleashed, armed with state-of-the-art modern technology.
The fatwa on Rushdie was vintage Khomeini. He rode on someone else's cause, and he preempted them, because he understood that here was yet another way that you can keep Iran isolated and embattled.
Rushdie was forced to go underground. Like the American embassy staff, he became another hostage for Khomeini.
He was obviously a very frightened man, and I don't blame him. At the university, those who are real Islamists, the young, are still as angry as can be at Salman Rushdie.
To the Western world, the fatwa was a potent and shocking symbol of a revolution gone mad, and a revolutionary leader deaf to world opinion.
When Khomeini chose to deliver his judgment against Rushdie, he had some purpose. And the argument's made that Khomeini did this in order to freeze this warming process toward the West that people in the government were undertaking.
But if this was Khomeini's most provocative and alienating gesture to date, it was also his last. In June 1989, the Ayatollah underwent surgery. There were complications due to internal bleeding, and a series of heart attacks followed. In a matter of days, the Ayatollah was dead. The funeral was, like so much of Khomeini's life, at once spiritual and political, symbolic and sincere.
That whole city of Tehran was like a river of black. People dressed in mourning clothes were just pouring down every street and every avenue from far, far into the mountains that ring the city. It was an astonishing sight.
It was astonishing, but perhaps not entirely surprising. For if Americans had seen Khomeini as a religious tyrant who had wrought only destruction, many Iranians saw instead a liberator who had brought them a new sense of national pride and dignity.
I remember going to a party with some very westernized miniskirt wearing, Madonna playing Tehranis, and one of them, much to my astonishment, said that she'd cried and had to take a Valium when she heard that he'd died. She still respected the way he'd stood up to the West, and she said nobody in their history had done that before. I think he gave a lot of Iranians a real pride.
It is an ironic legacy. The simple cleric who rose to defeat a dictator, only to become one himself.
Once he was in the position of power, his absolutist and self-righteous ideology expedited and intensified the process of corruption. But he proved that even a 75-year-old man could be deeply corrupted by power.
Khomeini, to a certain extent, was a mirage. He was all things to all people, and yet, in many ways, not any of those things. He was a brilliant politician, a victor of circumstances.
Khomeini's legacy, like his life, is a mass of contradictions. He was a medieval cleric with modern political ambitions, an enlightened husband who suppressed the rights of women, a rigid conservative who challenged the status quo, and finally, a ruthless oppressor who to his followers became a symbol of freedom.
Khomeini will stand out as one of the at least half dozen most important figures of the 20th century. The change represented by that revolution and the inspiration it gave to religious political movements around the world, I think, is incalculable.
He was a man who made no apologies for the dictatorship he imposed, because it was the dictatorship for the good. And there is a riddle about Khomeini. Did Khomeini save Iran or did he destroy it? And the honest answer must surely be both.
The biography you've just seen was viewed prior to broadcast by members of the British Muslim community. They expressed their concern about its objectivity in parts. The History Channel strives for the highest standards of objectivity and accuracy, but we recognize that the interpretation of historical events will always be argued by historians and participants on both sides of those events. We therefore welcome debate on historical points of view and have offered members of the British Muslim community a right to reply to the contents of this program.
We just watched the program Ayatollah Khomeini, Holy Terror. And one of the things that struck me first off was the production itself, the stylistic conventions that the producers relied upon to almost dramatize what was ostensibly a biography or a documentary, even to the point of melodrama. For example, the case of showing close-ups of his kind of sinister eyes with ominous music playing, or scenes of veiled women with flutes playing, something out of the harem, for example. What do these conventions assume about the audience for this program? And what do you think the producers want the audience to feel when they watch this program?
First of all, obviously the documentary is playing up to all the stereotypical images of Muslims, and unfortunately it assumes that the audience is ignorant or playing up to their prejudices, which I personally do not agree with. I think the audience, I'm sure, is far more sophisticated than that, and they'll be able to see through these kinds of techniques that are being used to influence their thinking about Imam Khomeini and his personality.
Perhaps the stylistic conventions are sort of a cover maybe for some of the more gross factual inaccuracies in the program. Could you comment on some of those?
Yes, certainly. For instance, we saw in the documentary people hanging from cranes. Now, these are photographs from the time of the Shah. I mean, it is unfair to project that image onto the image of the Islamic Revolution or part of Imam Khomeini's legacy. Beyond that, in fact, there are certain omissions. For instance, not enough emphasis is placed on reflecting what were the forces that motivated Imam Khomeini. This documentary projects Imam Khomeini as if he's somehow possessed by a personal vengeance against the Shah. I mean, there's nothing personal about it. The fact of the matter is that Iran under the Shah was a US colony. There had been a coup brought about by the CIA in 1953, overthrowing a popular government. America's influence in Iran was immense. The people resented it not only because they lost their own freedoms, but also because America also trained the SAVAK, the torture police of the Shah, which tortured literally tens of thousands of people, many of them to death and so on. There is no mention of that. So in fact, Imam Khomeini was not carrying out a personal grudge. What he was doing was reflecting the deep resentment of the people of Iran. One other aspect that comes through is that, you know, in any accurate portrayal or a balanced portrayal of any personality, you would at least take the evidence from the other side as well. There was none of, you know, that presented. I mean, one could give an example, for instance, of Winston Churchill. If you wanted to make a biographical sketch of Winston Churchill, would it be fair to just have the Nazis and some of the Soviet agents who escaped from Britain, like Kim Philby or Maclean's or Burgess and so on, to give their opinions and not have anything of Winston Churchill's colleagues to comment on his life? I mean, it would be a very inaccurate portrayal. And these are some of the things that I think are missing in this documentary.
It seems that what they're trying to do is to leave us with some remembrance or a legacy, perhaps, of Imam Khomeini, incomplete as it is. Could you comment in the brief time that we have on what you think that legacy is, both for Iran and for the Muslims?
Certainly. First of all, Imam Khomeini was not a brutal dictator as they present him to be. We can compare that with his welcoming arrival in Tehran in 79, when 3 million people welcomed him, and when he passed away in June of 89, 10 million people, you know, participated in his funeral. That sort of takes care of that. The other aspect is basically the very fundamental legacy of Imam Khomeini, that he has shown to the Muslims of the world and other oppressed people that you can bring about change in your society through your own value system. I think this is a very powerful message that resonates throughout the world, particularly in the Muslim world, and its impact actually is felt around the world.
Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.